Thank you, Jason. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm here to talk about my book, as Jason said, Licentious Gotham, which in large part is a business history of what people in the 19th century often referred to as the licentious print trade or sometimes as the indecent print trade. At the same time, the book tells a legal history about the origins of prohibitions on obscenity in American law. And finally, it offers a cultural and social history of 19th century New York City, which is a time and a place that have long fascinated me and made the process of researching and writing this book a really wonderful and enjoyable experience. For tonight, I thought I'd talk a little bit about one of the principal figures in Licentious Gotham, a very enterprising publisher named George Ackerman, who produced a prodigious quantity of so-called licentious literature from approximately 1850 until the early 1870s. As you might imagine, I came across quite a few colorful and provocative characters while researching the book, but I found myself particularly drawn to Ackerman, largely because he stood out to me as one of the most savvy and enterprising specialists in his field. Indeed, by the end of his career, he was widely recognized as the nation's second largest producer of erotic materials, second only to another legendary New York producer named William Haynes. In addition, I thought I'd focus on Ackerman this evening because his career helps to illuminate two of the central themes of my book. The first being the important ways in which obscenity law shaped the identities of publishers of erotica, as well as the business practices they employed, and the style of the texts that they marketed. And the second theme being the critical ways in which the commercial success of publishers like Ackerman shaped the evolution of obscenity regulation, especially as it shifted from local to state to ultimately national forms of censorship over the course of the 19th century. But before we get to Ackerman, I want to take a few moments to do two preliminary things. First, since we're here tonight in New York City on Lower Fifth Avenue, I'd like to describe the geographic place where the indecent print trade, the erotic print trade, was located for much of the 19th century. And second, I'd like to define two separate genres of controversial texts that circulated in 19th century New York. Guardians of middle-class culture often lump these two genres together as immoral and indecent, but they actually had quite distinct characteristics for publishers such as Ackerman, as well as for legal authorities in New York City. Okay, first the setting. Geographically speaking, the most striking thing about the indecent print trade was that it was very heavily concentrated along a small street in Lower Manhattan, located near the financial district called Nassau Street, which of course exists today. In the 1800s, Nassau in its entirety was a mere 10 blocks long. Running from north to south, it began just below City Hall at Frankfurt Street, which is now the site of Pace University, and it ended at the intersection with Wall Street, near what is now the site of the Federal Hall Museum. During the 19th century, Nassau Street was viewed as having a number of decidedly curious features. For one thing, it projected a strangely old world, almost uncanny quality. One 19th century guidebook described the street as one of the most peculiar places in the city. Crooked, contracted, unclean, with high houses and low houses, marble palaces and dingy frames, it was said to resemble a street in an old continental town more than a popular thoroughfare in the New Republic. Even though lots and lots of people complained that Nassau was uncomfortably narrow and dark and winding and dirty, it still managed to function as one of the busiest commercial spaces in the city. Indeed, the area was so hectic and so chaotic during the workday that many 19th century New Yorkers considered it physically dangerous just to pass through the street in order to do whatever business they had to do. They called them there. Together with its feeling of claustrophobic denseness and congestion, Nassau also had a faint air of mystery and decrepitude. The author of the guide I just referred to also had this to say about the street. Nassau has more back offices and upper stories and creaking stairways and cobwebby corners and dingy crannies and undreamed of lofts and out-of-the-way places generally than could be found in all of Dickens's novels. Now, This portrayal of Nassau as eerie and Dickensian also served to contrast the street with the comparatively gleaming brightness and far greater respectability of Broadway. Broadway, which was located just one block to Nassau's west, was considered the city's most glamorous and fashionable thoroughfare. So it was in stark contrast to Nassau's dinginess and sort of air of disrepute. In the 1800s, Nassau Street was also known for being the home of New York's printing and publishing trade. As such, it was jam-packed with bookstores, print shops, secondhand and antiquarian book dealers, lithographers, job printers, stationers, and engravers, as well as more substantial newspaper offices and publishing firms. Indeed, because of its very close association with the book trade and the newspaper industry, the street was often referred to as being the brain of New York City. Whether or not that was true, case files of obscenity prosecutions reveal that at least some editors and publishers who worked on Nassau Street were engaged in something other than purely intellectual pursuits. In particular, we know that Nassau functioned as the epicenter of New York's 19th century indecent print trade, especially in the densely crowded blocks between Liberty and Ann Streets. One more preliminary note before we get to Ackerman, and this one's about terminology. One of the things that I found most interesting about publishers of salacious books who congregated along Nassau Street and its side streets was that they paid very careful attention to the law of obscenity and to how it was enforced. Indeed, this attentiveness led them to classify their offerings according to a work's relative risk of instigating prosecution, as well as its relative attractiveness as more or less forbidden. Specifically, publishers like Ackerman categorized their products as either fancy on the one hand or racy on the other. For instance, books advertised as fancy, fancy being the 19th century term for what we might today call pornography. Books advertised as fancy often contained explicit descriptions of sexual conduct. They might also include graphic engravings depicting erotic themes. In contrast, books described as racy describe sex in much more elliptical, euphemistic language. What racy books withheld in terms of explicit sex, however, they more than made up for in terms of violence, which was typically set forth in lavish, gruesome detail. Now, in 19th century New York, it was widely understood that a major motivation for publishers to cultivate this distinction between the racy and the fancy was their concern about prosecution for obscenity, a danger that first emerged as a significant threat in New York in the early 1840s. One mid-19th century observer described the influence of obscenity law in this way. Racy books, he asserted, were written in a strain eminently calculated to excite the passions, but so carefully guarded as to avoid absolute obscenity. In addition, they were embellished with woodcuts which approached lasciviousness as nearly as possible without being indictable. Moreover, for much of the 19th century, New York officials played along with this strategy, despite the protests of many middle-class moralists, by targeting only fancy books for prosecution, while permitting graphically violent, semi-erotic, racy books to circulate more or less freely. One of the things that made working in the indecent print business tricky, however, was that the same people who produced the relatively safe, racy publications also produced the fancy works that could trigger prosecution. As a result, principals in this industry constantly had to straddle a line between licit and illicit activity. So, with that introduction to the physical setting and to some 19th century terminology, I'd like now to turn to the publisher George Ackerman. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Ackerman became intimately familiar with the Nassau Street milieu I've described, launching a series of publishing firms and other business ventures in the vicinity of Nassau Street during the 1850s. In addition, Ackerman was a man who became very adept at operating with one foot in the world of criminal enterprise and one foot outside of it. And here I'll read a short excerpt about Ackerman's activities from Chapter 5 of Licentious Gotham, which is called Venus in the Mail, the chapter. By the middle of the 1850s, Ackerman, who had begun his career actually as very modestly as a journeyman bookbinder, he had amassed enough capital to create his own little empire of commercial vice.